Admiral Morrison's coffee cup crashed to the deck when he spotted me at my brother's Coast Guard promotion ceremony. His entire body snapped to attention and he stammered, "Ma'am, Chief Martinez, Maritime Force Chief?" In that moment, my family realized the daughter they'd called stupid for 30 years was actually commanding the entire Coast Guard's maritime operations across 3 oceans. They brought out the family photo albums. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My mother arranged them chronologically on the dining room table. My father put on his reading glasses like he was preparing to deliver a medical diagnosis. But I knew exactly what this was, an intervention disguised as a family history lesson, designed to prove once and for all that I was the Martinez family's intellectual disappointment. That Saturday afternoon, surrounded by 30 years of documented evidence that my brother Diego was the smart one, they made their final verdict clear. "Elena," my father said with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child, "we think it's time you accepted your limitations and found work that suits your capabilities." My mother nodded as if she was discussing which cleaning products to buy. My father smiled like he was offering me a gift I should be grateful for. I sat there listening to them plan my intellectual surrender, and something inside me finally broke. Because what they didn't know, what they'd spent 3 decades refusing to see, was who I really was. I'm Elena Martinez. I'm 32 years old. And my family spent my entire life calling me stupid while I became one of the most strategically important leaders in the United States Coast Guard. The Martinez household had always operated on a simple premise. Intelligence was measurable, quantifiable, and clearly distributed. Diego, my younger brother by 3 years, was the designated genius. He'd spoken in complete sentences by age 2, read chapter books by kindergarten, and sailed through school with the kind of effortless academic success that made teachers remember him years later. Me? I was the slow one. The daughter who took longer to read, who struggled with standardized tests, who asked different kinds of questions that teachers couldn't answer. When Diego scored in the 99th percentile on his SATs, they threw a celebration dinner. When I scored in the 75th percentile after months of tutoring, they patted my head and said, "You did your best, Mija." By the time we reached high school, the family narrative was set in stone. Diego would become an engineer, doctor, or scientist, something that required the kind of analytical intelligence our parents could recognize and measure. I would find something practical, maybe teaching elementary school, or nursing, or administrative work that didn't require too much critical thinking. The irony was that I'd always been the one who understood how systems worked. Not the textbook kind of systems that Diego excelled at memorizing, but real-world, complex, interconnected systems that required spatial reasoning and strategic thinking. While Diego could calculate the theoretical load capacity of a bridge, I could look at traffic patterns and predict where the next accident would occur. But those kinds of intelligence weren't tested on standardized exams. They weren't measured by grade point averages or academic awards. They were invisible to parents who equated smart with scholarly and couldn't recognize brilliance that didn't come with a report card. When I graduated high school with decent but unremarkable grades, my parents' response was predictable relief. "Elena's found her level," my mother told relatives. "She's not academic like Diego, but she's got other strengths." What those other strengths were, they never bothered to define. Diego went to MIT on a full scholarship, studying aerospace engineering with the kind of focus that made our parents glow with pride. I joined the Coast Guard, partly because I was drawn to maritime operations, and partly because it was the only path that felt authentically mine. "It's perfect for Elena," my father told anyone who asked. "The military has structure, clear rules. She won't have to think too much for herself." They attended my Coast Guard graduation ceremony with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for my high school graduation, polite obligation mixed with modest relief that I'd found somewhere to belong. They took pictures, shook hands with my commanding officers, and went home confident that their intellectually limited daughter had found an appropriate place in the world. What they never understood was that the Coast Guard doesn't just need people who can follow orders. It needs people who can think in 3 dimensions, anticipate complex scenarios, and make split-second decisions that affect thousands of lives across vast oceanic territories. For 14 years, I let them believe their comfortable fiction. It was easier than trying to explain strategic maritime operations to people who thought my greatest intellectual achievement was remembering to wear matching socks. The conversation that shattered my last thread of tolerance happened on a humid Tuesday evening in Miami, where I was visiting during what my family believed was shore leave, but was actually a strategic planning conference with Caribbean maritime commanders. I walked into my parents' kitchen to find them huddled over Diego's laptop, examining what appeared to be job listings and community college brochures. My mother looked up with the expression she reserved for discussing my various shortcomings. "Elena, perfect timing. Your father and I have been researching options for you." I set down the bottle of wine I'd brought, a small gesture of appreciation for their hospitality that was about to become irrelevant. "Options for what?" My father adjusted his glasses and turned the laptop toward me. "Career alternatives. You've been in the Coast Guard for 14 years now, and it's clear you've hit your ceiling. Time to transition to something more suitable." The screen displayed a collection of administrative positions: office manager, customer service supervisor, medical receptionist. Jobs that required basic competency but no real intellectual challenge. "We know you've been struggling to advance," my mother added gently, as if delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Your brother mentioned that most of his Coast Guard friends are officers by now, and you're still—" She gestured vaguely, unsure of my actual rank. "Still what, Mom?" "Well, enlisted," my father said with the confidence of someone who had no idea what he was talking about. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, Mija. Not everyone is cut out for leadership roles." The assumption hit me like cold water. My parents had spent 14 years believing I was still an enlisted Coast Guard member, probably somewhere around petty officer level, grinding through a career that had already peaked. They'd never asked about promotions, never inquired about my duties, never wondered why I traveled so frequently or why my leave often coincided with international maritime crises. "Your cousin Maria got her real estate license last year," my mother continued. "She's doing very well. Or there's that community college program for medical billing. Very stable, good benefits." I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw two people who had decided my intellectual limitations were so severe that even 14 years of military service couldn't overcome them. They weren't trying to hurt me. They genuinely believed they were helping their intellectually challenged daughter plan for a realistic future. "Diego thinks you should consider going back to school," my father added. "Get some basic credentials before you age out of the Coast Guard." He offered to help with the application process. Diego. Of course. My MIT-educated aerospace engineer brother, who was currently serving as a Coast Guard lieutenant in logistics coordination, had apparently been consulted about my career limitations. The irony was suffocating. They'd asked for guidance from the son who reported to officers who reported to commanders who ultimately reported to me. "What exactly did Diego tell you about my service record?" I asked carefully. "He didn't want to hurt your feelings," my mother said, "but he mentioned that advancement has been challenging for you. He said most people with your time in service would be in more senior positions by now." The diplomatic way my brother had described my advancement challenges, while protecting my security clearance, was almost admirable. He'd managed to express concern about my career trajectory without revealing that his sister outranked every Coast Guard officer he'd ever met. "He's worried about you, Elena," my father continued. "We all are. You're 32 years old and you're still living paycheck to paycheck on enlisted wages. No house, no family, no real prospects for advancement. It's time to be realistic about your options." I stood in that kitchen, surrounded by job listings for work that would represent a devastating career downgrade, listening to my parents plan my intellectual retreat, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. "What if you're wrong about my limitations?" I asked quietly. My father's laugh was gentle but crushing. "Mija, we've watched you struggle with academics your entire life. There's no shame in accepting who you are and building a life around your actual capabilities." That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at glow-in-the-dark stars Diego had put on the ceiling when we were kids, and made the decision that would change everything. I was done hiding who I'd become to protect their comfortable assumptions about who I'd always been. The first crack in my family's carefully constructed narrative came 3 days after the career intervention, when Diego called me directly for the first time in months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying an uncertainty I'd never heard before. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I was in my Washington, D.C. office at Coast Guard headquarters, reviewing deployment schedules for 3 maritime task forces. But Diego didn't know that. As far as he was concerned, I was probably cleaning equipment at some regional station. "What's on your mind?" "Yesterday, Admiral Morrison asked me about my family. Standard conversation, nothing unusual. But when I mentioned I had a sister in the Coast Guard, he got this weird look on his face." My stomach clenched. Admiral Morrison was my former deputy commander, recently promoted to oversee Atlantic operations. He knew exactly who Diego Martinez's sister was. "What kind of weird look?" "Like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He asked what your name was, and when I said Elena Martinez, he just stared at me for like 10 seconds. Then he asked if you were stationed locally." I could picture Morrison's confusion perfectly. He was probably wondering why Lieutenant Martinez was discussing his commanding officer as if she were some distant family member he barely knew. "What did you tell him?" "I said I wasn't sure where you were stationed currently, that you moved around a lot, but we didn't really discuss the details of your work. And Elena..." Diego paused. He looked at me like I'd just said something impossible. The silence stretched between us while I tried to figure out how to navigate this conversation without violating security protocols or completely destroying my brother's worldview. "Diego," I said carefully, "what do you actually know about my service record? I know you've been in for 14 years. I know you're enlisted, probably somewhere around E6 or E7 by now. I know you do some kind of operations work because you travel a lot. Why? E6 or E7? My brother thought I was a petty officer first class or chief petty officer. The gap between his assumptions and reality was so vast it was almost comical. What if I told you that your assumptions about my rank were wrong? Wrong how? Before I could answer, my aide knocked on my office door. "Ma'am, the Secretary of Homeland Security is here for your 1400 briefing." I muted the phone quickly, but not quickly enough. "Elena?" Diego's voice carried a new tone, confusion mixed with something that might have been alarm. "Did someone just call you ma'am and mention the Secretary of Homeland Security?" I unmuted the phone, knowing that this conversation had just taken a turn I couldn't control. "Diego, I need to call you back." "Elena, wait. What's going on? Where are you right now?" "I'm at work." "What kind of work involves briefing the Secretary of Homeland Security?" I looked through my office window at the Potomac River, at the Washington Monument visible in the distance, at the bustling headquarters of an organization that most people assumed was just a maritime rescue service, but actually coordinated some of the most complex operations in federal law enforcement. "The kind of work that requires security clearances you don't have," I said finally. "Security clearances?" Diego's voice cracked slightly. "Elena, what the hell do you actually do for a living?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 14 years, I'd let my family believe I was intellectually limited, professionally stagnant, and barely competent enough to maintain basic military employment. The fiction had been easier than explaining why their slow daughter had access to classified information that could affect international relations. "Diego," I said, "I think it's time you learned who your sister really is." "What do you mean?" "I mean, tomorrow is your promotion ceremony, right? You're making lieutenant commander?" "Yeah, but what does that have to? Admiral Morrison will be there? He's presenting the promotions." "Elena, you're scaring me. What's going on?" I made the decision that would change everything. "I'll be there." "You'll be where?" "At your promotion ceremony." "Elena, it's a military ceremony. Family members sit in the audience section. You can't just..." "Diego," I said quietly, "I won't be sitting in the audience." After my cryptic conversation with Diego, I spent the next 18 hours conducting the most painful investigation of my career, examining how thoroughly my family had constructed their narrative of my intellectual inadequacy. I started with social media, something I'd avoided for security reasons but could access through official channels when necessary. My mother's Facebook page was a carefully curated shrine to her children's achievements, but the distribution was telling. Diego's MIT graduation, 47 photos, and a 2-paragraph essay about our brilliant son. His Coast Guard commissioning, a professional photo album, with detailed captions about his exceptional leadership potential. My Coast Guard achievements were represented by exactly 3 photos over 14 years. My basic training graduation, a single shot of me in uniform with the caption "Elena finished her Coast Guard training." My promotion to Chief Petty Officer 6 years ago, which my parents had attended but apparently not understood, was documented with one blurry photo labeled "Elena at another Coast Guard thing." There was no mention of my subsequent officer commissioning, my rapid advancement through lieutenant and lieutenant commander ranks, or my appointment to Maritime Force Chief. According to my mother's digital record, I'd been frozen in time as a basic enlisted member for over a decade. The pattern became clearer when I found a post from last year where a family friend had asked about my career. My mother's response was devastating in its casual dismissal. "Elena's still in the Coast Guard doing her thing. She's not ambitious like Diego, but the military gives her structure and purpose. We're proud of her for finding her place." Her place. As if I were some special needs child who'd found appropriate supervision. I dug deeper, accessing archived news coverage through official channels. The Miami Herald had covered my appointment as Maritime Force Chief 18 months ago, a significant promotion that made me responsible for coordinating Coast Guard operations across the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and Eastern Atlantic. The article included my name, photograph, and detailed background. My parents lived in Miami. They read the Herald daily. They'd either never seen the article or had somehow failed to connect Chief Elena Martinez with their daughter Elena. The most damning evidence came from Diego's own social media. His LinkedIn profile listed his current position as Lieutenant U.S. Coast Guard Logistics Coordination, with a detailed description of his responsibilities managing supply chains for regional operations. Professional, thorough, and clearly written by someone who understood military hierarchy. But buried in his older posts, I found something that made my blood run cold. A photo from 2 years ago showing him at a Coast Guard conference, smiling next to several senior officers. The caption read, "Great discussion about advancement opportunities with some of the Coast Guard's top leadership. Hoping to follow in the footsteps of officers like these someday." One of the officers in the photo was me, in dress blues with all my rank insignia clearly visible. Diego had been in the same room with his sister, recognizing her as, quote, top leadership he hoped to emulate, while somehow never making the connection that the senior officer was also the family member he considered professionally stagnant. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. My brother had literally posed for photos with me in my official capacity while maintaining the belief that I was an underachieving enlisted member. I called my Chief of Staff, Captain Williams, to verify something that was becoming increasingly clear. "Captain, I need you to pull Lieutenant Commander Martinez's file." Diego Martinez, currently assigned to Miami Sector Logistics. "Yes, ma'am. Any particular reason?" "I need to know if there are any flags or notes about family security clearances." 20 minutes later, Williams called back with information that explained everything. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Martinez has a standard secret clearance. His file shows family members with higher clearances, but no details are listed. Standard protocol for need to know." Diego knew that someone in his family had higher security clearance than he did, but classification protocols prevented him from knowing who or what level. He'd probably assumed it was some administrative detail, never imagining that his intellectually limited sister held clearances that would make his head spin. The final piece of the puzzle came when I reviewed my own personnel file. For 14 years, I'd listed my parents as emergency contacts, but with strict instructions that no military information should be shared with them without my explicit approval. I'd been so focused on protecting my family from the complexity of my career that I'd accidentally enabled their ignorance. They'd spent 14 years thinking I was a failure because I'd never given them the information they needed to think otherwise. Planning Diego's promotion ceremony revelation required the same strategic precision I brought to coordinating multi-agency maritime operations. This wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about ensuring that 14 years of family misconceptions could be corrected in a single, undeniable moment. Admiral Morrison became my unwitting primary ally. I called him directly from my secure line, explaining that I needed to attend Lieutenant Commander Martinez's promotion ceremony in an official capacity. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his confusion evident even through the encrypted connection, "isn't Martinez your brother? Doesn't he know you'll be attending?" "Admiral, my family believes I'm an enlisted member who's hit her career ceiling. They have no idea what my actual position is." The silence that followed was so long I wondered if our connection had been compromised. "Ma'am," Morrison said finally, "are you telling me that your own family doesn't know you're the Maritime Force Chief?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Admiral." "But how is that possible? Your appointment was covered in every major maritime publication. The ceremony at Coast Guard headquarters was broadcast on military networks. My family doesn't read maritime publications, Admiral. And they certainly don't watch military broadcasts. As far as they're concerned, I'm still the intellectually limited daughter who was lucky to find a place in the Coast Guard at all." Morrison's response was a mixture of professional incredulity and personal outrage. "Ma'am, with respect, this situation is unprecedented. Your brother has served under officers who ultimately report to you. How has he never made the connection? Classification protocols. My family members know someone in the household has higher clearances, but they assume it's administrative paperwork, not operational authority." I outlined my strategy. Morrison would conduct the promotion ceremony normally, but when he spotted me in the audience, he would react with the appropriate military protocol for encountering a superior officer. Natural, genuine, and impossible to misinterpret. "What do you need from me, ma'am?" "I need you to be yourself, Admiral. When you see the Maritime Force Chief at a Coast Guard ceremony, respond accordingly. Don't downplay the moment for my family's comfort." My next ally was Captain Sarah Chen, my former executive officer who was now commanding the Miami sector where Diego was stationed. Sarah had worked closely with me during the Caribbean drug interdiction operations and understood both military protocol and family dynamics. "Chief," she said when I called, "I've been wondering when this situation would reach a breaking point. Your brother's talked about you during officer meetings. He clearly loves you, but he describes you like you're some distant relative who got lost in the system." "How so?" "He mentions having a sister in the Coast Guard who does operations work, but never advances. He says it respectfully, but there's this undertone of protective concern, like he's worried about your career prospects." The protective concern was almost more painful than outright dismissal. Diego wasn't cruel about my perceived limitations. He was genuinely worried about his sister's future in an organization where he was thriving and I was supposedly stagnating. "What's your assessment of his readiness for this revelation?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Chief, Diego's a good officer. Smart, capable, respected by his peers. But he's also someone who trusts institutional hierarchies. When he learns that his family has been wrong about you for 14 years, it's going to shake his faith in his own judgment." The third piece of my strategy involved my parents. I couldn't prepare them without spoiling the impact, but I needed them positioned correctly when the moment arrived. I called my mother with a simple request. "Mom, I'd like to attend Diego's promotion ceremony." "Oh, Elena, that's wonderful. It's next Friday at the Miami Coast Guard station. Family members sit in the designated area, and there's a reception afterward. I'll be there." "We're so proud of Diego. Lieutenant Commander, can you imagine? Our son giving orders to other officers." The irony was suffocating, but I kept my voice neutral. "I'm proud of him too, Mom." The night before the ceremony, I made one final call to Diego. He'd been trying to reach me for 3 days, clearly unsettled by our last conversation and Admiral Morrison's strange behavior. "Elena," he said immediately when he answered, "I need to know what's going on. Morrison's been asking weird questions about you all week. And Mom said you're coming to the ceremony tomorrow." "I am. Elena, you're freaking me out. What aren't you telling me?" "Diego," I said carefully, "tomorrow you're going to learn something about your sister that changes everything you think you know about our family." "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes the person closest to you is the hardest to see clearly. The morning of Diego's promotion ceremony arrived with the precision of a military operation. I'd spent weeks orchestrating every detail, but now the moment required perfect execution and flawless timing. I began my preparation at 0500 hours in my Washington hotel room, laying out my dress blues with the same methodical care I brought to mission planning. The uniform carried 14 years of achievements my family had never acknowledged: ribbons for operational excellence, decorations for maritime leadership, and insignia that marked me as one of the highest-ranking officers in the Coast Guard. The Maritime Force Chief insignia was particularly significant, a gold eagle with anchor and shield that only a handful of people in the world were authorized to wear. My parents had seen me in uniform dozens of times over the years, but they'd never bothered to learn what any of the symbols meant. At 0800 hours, I received a text from Captain Chen. All personnel briefed and positioned. Admiral Morrison is prepared for natural reaction protocol. Your family arrived 15 minutes ago and are seated in the front row of the family section. The flight to Miami gave me 3 hours to mentally prepare for what was about to unfold. I'd coordinated operations that affected international maritime security, but this personal mission felt more consequential than any professional challenge I'd ever faced. I arrived at the Miami Coast Guard station at 1330 hours, 30 minutes before the ceremony. The parking lot was filled with military vehicles and family cars, including my parents' modest sedan that had carried them to years of Diego's achievements and none of mine. Through the windows of the ceremony hall, I could see the formal setup: a stage with Coast Guard flags, rows of chairs for family members, and a designated area for attending officers. My parents sat in the front row, my mother wearing the navy dress she reserved for important occasions, my father in his best suit with a Coast Guard pin on his lapel. Diego stood with the other promotion candidates, looking sharp in his dress blues, occasionally glancing toward the family section with obvious pride. He had no idea that in 20 minutes, his understanding of his family would be fundamentally altered. Admiral Morrison was positioned at the podium, reviewing his notes with the careful attention of someone who knew he was about to participate in something unprecedented. Captain Chen stood with the other attending officers, maintaining the professional demeanor we'd agreed upon, while staying alert for my arrival. At exactly 1400 hours, I walked through the main entrance of the ceremony hall. The effect was immediate but subtle. The enlisted personnel near the door straightened unconsciously when they saw my rank insignia. A lieutenant colonel from the Marine Corps, attending as someone's guest, caught sight of my uniform and did a double-take at the Maritime Force Chief designation. But my family, seated with their backs to the entrance, remained oblivious to the shift in military protocol happening behind them. I made my way to the officers' section, each step measured and deliberate. As I moved through the hall, Coast Guard personnel recognized my rank and position with the automatic respect that senior leadership commands. Conversations quieted slightly. Officers straightened. The military machinery of recognition and hierarchy activated around me. My parents continued their quiet conversation about Diego's bright future, completely unaware that the daughter they'd spent 30 years calling intellectually limited was causing ripples of recognition throughout the room. I took my designated seat in the front row of the officers' section, directly behind my family but separated by the invisible barrier of military protocol. My mother was close enough that I could have reached out and touched her shoulder, but she remained focused on the stage where her brilliant son was about to be honored. Admiral Morrison stepped to the podium at precisely 1415 hours, his eyes scanning the audience with professional efficiency. When his gaze reached the officers' section, I saw the exact moment he spotted me. His prepared remarks about the importance of Coast Guard leadership suddenly seemed to take on deeper meaning as he looked directly at the Maritime Force Chief sitting in his audience. The promotion ceremony proceeded with military precision for exactly 18 minutes. Admiral Morrison delivered remarks about Coast Guard excellence, read the promotion orders, and began pinning new rank insignia on the advancing officers. Diego beamed as he received his lieutenant commander bars, scanning the family section to catch my parents' proud expressions. Then Morrison announced the traditional reception line, where family members could congratulate the newly promoted officers and meet the attending leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said from the podium, "we invite family members to join us in congratulating today's promoted officers. Please feel free to meet with the command staff and learn more about the Coast Guard's mission and leadership." My parents rose with obvious excitement, my mother clutching her purse and my father straightening his tie. They'd been looking forward to this moment, the chance to bask in Diego's achievement and perhaps meet some of the senior officers who would shape his career. I remained seated in the officers' section as families began moving toward the reception area. The plan required perfect timing. Morrison needed to spot me naturally, not as part of a staged encounter. Diego was surrounded by well-wishers when my parents approached him, their faces glowing with pride. I watched my mother hug him, my father shake his hand with the formal ceremony he reserved for important occasions. They were living their dream, the validation of their smart son's success and an organization they respected. Morrison began working the reception line, greeting families with the practiced charm of senior leadership. He moved methodically through the crowd, shaking hands with spouses and parents, answering questions about Coast Guard operations, and offering congratulations on their loved one's achievements. Then he spotted me. I had risen from my seat and was moving toward the reception area when Morrison's eyes locked onto mine. His coffee cup, which he'd been holding casually while chatting with a colonel's wife, slipped from his fingers, as if his nervous system had suddenly shut down. The ceramic mug crashed against the deck with a sound that cut through the polite reception chatter like a gunshot. Coffee splashed across the polished floor, creating a dark stain that seemed to spread in slow motion. Every conversation in the immediate vicinity stopped. Heads turned toward the commotion. But Morrison was already moving, his body snapping to rigid military attention with the automatic precision of decades of service. In a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of someone recognizing superior rank, he declared, "Ma'am, Chief Martinez, Maritime Force Chief." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The entire reception area fell silent. Officers straightened unconsciously. Family members turned to see what had caused this dramatic shift in military protocol. My parents, who had been chatting with Diego about his promotion prospects, froze mid-sentence. My mother turned first, following Morrison's gaze to where I stood in my dress blues. Her face went through a rapid progression of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then a kind of stunned disbelief as she processed what she was seeing. "Elena?" she whispered, as if she were seeing an apparition. My father's reaction was even more dramatic. His mouth fell open, his face went pale, and he actually took a step backward, as if he'd been physically struck. Diego stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part shock, part awe, and part something that might have been terror at the implications of what he was witnessing. "Admiral Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the natural command authority I'd suppressed for 30 years of family interactions. "Good afternoon." Captain Chen materialized beside Morrison, her presence confirming what everyone in uniform already understood. They were witnessing something unprecedented. "Chief Martinez," she said with military formality, "we weren't expecting you at today's ceremony." The crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. The family members who'd been making small talk about their relatives' military careers suddenly realized they were in the presence of one of the Coast Guard's most senior leaders. My parents stood frozen, still processing the fact that their intellectually limited daughter was being addressed with the kind of respect reserved for the military's highest-ranking officials. "Mom, Dad," I said quietly, "I'd like you to meet my colleagues." The reception that followed Morrison's announcement transformed from a routine military gathering into something resembling a diplomatic summit. My parents found themselves in the surreal position of being introduced to senior officers who spoke about their intellectually limited daughter, with the kind of reverence typically reserved for legendary military leaders. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," Morrison said, his voice carrying professional warmth mixed with barely concealed amazement, "you must be incredibly proud of Chief Martinez's achievements. Her strategic coordination of Caribbean maritime operations has been exemplary." My mother's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so painful to watch. She looked at Morrison, then at me, then back at Morrison, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. "Strategic coordination?" she repeated weakly. "Oh, yes." Captain Chen joined the conversation, seemingly oblivious to my parents' shock. Chief Martinez revolutionized our approach to multi-agency operations. The drug interdiction protocols she developed are now used throughout the Caribbean basin. My father, who had spent 30 years explaining my intellectual limitations to anyone who would listen, stood silent as these senior officers discussed my professional achievements with obvious admiration. The most devastating moment came when Colonel Williams from the Marine Corps approached our group. "Chief Martinez," he said, with a respectful nod, "I wanted to thank you again for your testimony before the Joint Chiefs last month. Your insights on maritime security coordination were instrumental in our new strategic framework." Joint Chiefs. The words hung in the air like an accusation. My parents knew enough about military structure to understand that testifying before the Joint Chiefs of Staff meant their daughter operated at the highest levels of national defense policy. Diego, meanwhile, was experiencing his own crisis of understanding. He approached our group with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. "Elena," he said quietly, "I think I need you to explain some things to me. What would you like to know?" "For starters, what's a Maritime Force Chief?" Morrison answered before I could. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez. Your sister coordinates Coast Guard operations across 3 oceanic regions. She's responsible for strategic planning, resource allocation, and operational oversight for approximately 40,000 personnel." The number hit Diego like a physical blow. He'd been proud of his promotion to lieutenant commander, a rank that gave him authority over perhaps 50 people. Learning that his sister commanded operations involving 40,000 personnel redefined his understanding of military hierarchy. 40,000? My mother whispered. "The Maritime Force Chief position," Captain Chen explained with helpful precision, "is equivalent to a flag officer rank in other services. Chief Martinez essentially functions as a regional admiral for Coast Guard operations." Regional admiral. My parents exchanged glances that contained 30 years of recalculated assumptions about their daughter's intellectual capacity. The reception continued around us, but our family had become the center of a different kind of gathering. Officers who had worked with me over the years approached to pay their respects, each conversation adding another layer to my parents' growing realization of how completely they'd misunderstood my career. Lieutenant Colonel Santos, whom I'd worked with during hurricane relief operations, shared details about coordination efforts that had saved hundreds of lives. Commander Rodriguez described maritime law enforcement operations that had resulted in major drug seizures. Major Williams discussed international cooperation agreements I'd helped negotiate with Caribbean nations. Each conversation was another piece of evidence that their slow daughter had been operating at levels of responsibility and strategic thinking that most people never encounter. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Elena, all these years, when you said you couldn't discuss your work, I meant I couldn't discuss it, Dad. Not that there wasn't anything worth discussing. But you never told us. You never said you were. I tried to tell you. For 14 years, I tried to give you hints about what I was doing. You didn't want to hear it because it didn't match your assumptions about my capabilities." My mother was crying now, but trying to hide it behind her reception program. "We thought you were struggling. We thought you needed our help to find a better job. I know what you thought, Mom." Diego looked at our parents with something approaching anger. "You tried to get her to quit. Last week, you were showing her job listings for medical billing." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone in our immediate vicinity. The months following Diego's promotion ceremony felt like watching my family learn to speak a new language, one where their intellectually limited daughter was suddenly revealed as someone whose strategic thinking shaped national maritime policy. My parents' attempts at reconciliation were clumsy but desperate. My mother began sending me newspaper clippings about Coast Guard operations, as if she were trying to educate herself about an organization she'd dismissed for 14 years. My father started introducing me to his law colleagues as my daughter, the Maritime Force Chief, with a pride that felt both genuine and performative. The most painful conversations happened during family dinners, where my parents tried to rewrite the history of their dismissal into something more palatable. "We always knew you were special, Elena," my mother said during one particularly awkward meal. "We just didn't understand how the military worked. We thought you were being modest about your achievements." "Mom," I replied carefully, 3 months ago you tried to enroll me in a community college medical billing program because you thought I was too intellectually limited to advance in my career." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of unspoken admissions. Diego struggled the most with the revelation. His entire identity had been built around being the smart Martinez child, and learning that his slow sister outranked him professionally and intellectually had shaken his foundation. "I used to feel sorry for you," he confessed during one of our private conversations. "I thought you were stuck in some dead-end military job, and I felt guilty about my own success. I even offered to help you apply for civilian positions." I remember. Jesus, Elena. You were probably coordinating operations involving people who outrank my commanding officer, and I was worried about your career prospects. The relationship that emerged between Diego and me was different from anything we'd experienced as children. For the first time, he began seeking my advice, not as a big sister, but as a senior military leader whose strategic thinking had been tested in real-world scenarios. "I'm realizing," he said during one conversation, "that I never actually knew you. I knew the version of you that our parents created, but I never bothered to look beyond their assumptions. My parents' transformation was more dramatic but also more problematic. They threw themselves into military family activities, with the fervor of people trying to atone for decades of dismissal. My mother joined Coast Guard spouse groups, volunteered at veteran events, and spoke publicly about the importance of supporting military families. She's overcompensating," Diego observed, "but at least she's trying to understand what she missed." My father took a different approach, essentially rebuilding his law practice around military family advocacy. He began offering pro bono services to Coast Guard personnel, spoke at veterans events, and positioned himself as an expert on military family issues. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents were now making careers out of understanding the military culture they'd spent years dismissing when it applied to their own daughter. The most significant change was in how my extended family treated me. Cousins who'd pitied me at family gatherings suddenly wanted to discuss my career. Aunts and uncles who'd made jokes about my lack of direction now bragged to their friends about having a Maritime Force Chief in the family. "It's like watching people rewrite history in real time," I told my therapist, a conversation that had become necessary as I processed 30 years of intellectual dismissal followed by sudden reverence. The hardest part wasn't the family drama, it was learning to trust my own worth again. For so long, I'd internalized my family's assumptions about my limitations that even my professional success felt somehow fraudulent. "You've been leading complex operations for over a decade," my therapist pointed out. "At what point do you accept that maybe your family was wrong and you're actually extraordinary?" The answer came during a particularly challenging crisis, a hurricane that required coordinating rescue operations across 4 states. As I managed resources, personnel, and interagency cooperation that ultimately saved hundreds of lives, I realized something fundamental. I wasn't succeeding despite my family's assumptions about my intelligence. I was succeeding because those assumptions had always been wrong. 6 months after the promotion ceremony, my parents asked if they could attend one of my official events, a maritime security conference where I was delivering the keynote address. "We want to see you in your element," my mother said. "We want to understand who you really are." 3 years later, I stand in the same Coast Guard headquarters office where I first realized my family believed I was intellectually inferior, but everything has changed. The relationship that once caused me pain has become a source of strength for countless military families. My parents attended my keynote address at the Maritime Security Conference, watching their slow daughter deliver strategic insights to international defense leaders. My mother cried when the Secretary of Homeland Security introduced me as one of the most brilliant maritime strategists of our generation. "We were so busy looking for intelligence, we recognized that we missed the intelligence you actually possessed," she said afterward. Diego now speaks at Coast Guard training programs about recognizing diverse forms of military intelligence. "I spent years thinking my sister was intellectually limited while she was developing multidimensional strategic thinking most of us never achieve. The Coast Guard has implemented new assessment protocols based on our experience. Military families now receive better guidance on recognizing different types of intelligence and career paths. Last month, a Coast Guard lieutenant contacted me. Her professor parents believed she was wasting her PhD in marine biology in a non-intellectual military role. They had no idea she was developing revolutionary maritime environmental protection policies. "How do you help people see intelligence they don't recognize?" she asked. "Stop proving yourself according to their metrics and start demonstrating excellence according to your own." My parents now volunteer with military family organizations, helping others avoid their mistakes. My father's law practice advocates for service members, whose families don't understand their value. We want no family to experience what ours did, my mother tells military parents. Sometimes the people we love most are hardest to see clearly. My story became a Naval War College case study on how families unknowingly undermine military personnel through intellectual prejudice. Misclaimed. My name is Elena Martinez. I'm the Maritime Force Chief for the United States Coast Guard. Every day, I work to ensure no service member chooses between family understanding and serving their country with unique intelligence. Some battles are fought on oceans, others at kitchen tables. Both require courage, strategic thinking, and refusing to accept others' limitations as your reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.